Chapter 10, Religion as Cultural Superstructure. Yet the Phenomenology does not conclude with the chapter on morality which we have reinserted into a somewhat different narrative conclusion. There remain two further chapters, Religion, virtually a treatise in itself, and Absolute Spirit, a most sketchy and disappointing anticlimactic conclusion for so intricate a work. So far we have dealt with neither one, but I have a few proposals for doing so. Hegel is himself aware of the paradoxical nature of his return to the topic of religion here, after its various more purely historical or structural appearances in the earlier chapters, in Unhappy Consciousness, Early Christianity, or the struggle between belief and enlightenment. As with the other problems posed by the organization of the Phenomenology, external motives and authorial intentions are not satisfactory in explaining this enormous supplement, which we must account for by the supposition that the author felt something to be missing from his previous narrative, despite its chronological completion in the modern times of the 1807 writing. What is missing is then added by the narrative reduplication of everything that succeeded it, so that we have to go back in time, even earlier than the Greco-Roman period, in order to grasp the first rudimentary forms of religion in a prehistoric past which cannot even be supposed to correlate with the mythic time of the master/slave encounter. It should be added that this new narrative more or less coincides with the structural narrative of the Aesthetique. First, the primacy of matter over spirit, what Hegel calls the sublime, as in the pyramids. Second, their anthropomorphic equilibrium, as in classical Greek sculpture. Finally, the primacy of spirit over matter, as in the language arts, or in another way, Christianity. This third, or romantic, stage then proves to be in competition with philosophy, which would seem more fully and self-consciously, in the notion, to achieve what literature vainly attempts in the projects of romanticism or what theology projects as the Trinity. At this point, a new distinction is underscored between the picture thinking of art or religion and the philosophical notion, biography as such. This conflation of the dynamic of religion with that of aesthetics is very significant indeed, and we will return to it shortly. For the moment, what is indispensable is to bracket everything we traditionally associate with religion and to approach this topic as though it were utterly unfamiliar to us, as a Martian might approach human mental functions for which it has no equivalent. Let us assume, then, that Hegel is not theorizing this matter whose name we know already, and with which we are, closely or distantly, associated in daily life, people going to church, confessional adherence, rituals and devotional lip service, or at least recognized from a reading of history. The new interpretation will require us to deduce from Hegel's text what might be the object of his thinking in this chapter, or in other words what might for us be the equivalent of such an object in a postmodern world in which religion is merely the word for neo-ethnic group narcissisms, incomprehensible fanaticism, or one specific public language or code among others. I would suggest, then, that such an investigation will find itself pursuing three specific features, the seeming autonomy, or Selbstautonomie, of this strange object, the nature of its thought mode, namely Vorstellung, generally and most suggestively translated as picture thinking, and finally the problem of allegory. The kinship with art, whose consequences we have not yet fully explored, extends through each of these features. Thus, for example, that seeming autonomy of what Hegel calls religion, which dictates its separate treatment in what is a virtually self-complete chapter, and later on a whole separate seminar or lecture series, is certainly echoed by the self-completeness of Hegel's later aesthetic lectures. Here, in the Phenomenology, however, the opposite process would seem to be taking place, the religion chapter almost completely absorbing questions of art and aesthetics in such a way that they receive no independent treatment in their own right. Yet a kind of compromise is reached in which classical religion, apparently unacceptable to Hegel in the form of polytheism, finds itself partially replaced and represented by Greek drama and sculpture and by the communal ritual of the mysteries. There is, then, some structural analogy between the semi-autonomous status of art and that of religion here. Both are in the worldly events or activities within human life which are nonetheless sufficiently external to it to be capable of knowing their own developmental logic and functioning as independent sign systems, both reflecting the world in some way and able from time to time to intervene in it. This is the paradox Marcus theorized in the affirmative character of culture in which the amphibious status of such levels or forms enabled them to pass from a critical negation of their world to a slavish legitimization of and complicity with it, or rather, dialectically, to perform both functions simultaneously. But this structural ambiguity makes it clear why it is not possible to isolate such objects of study and to produce a systematic philosophy for them, for such philosophical definition already takes sides and endows the object with a positive or negative function that cancels the essential, namely the very ambiguity or unity of opposites that gives them their specificity in the first place. The autonomy of either art or religion is therefore to be found in the very impossibility of specifying their identities as autonomous levels or elements. At the same time both prove to be objects which call for the attention of theory, rather than philosophy, and of the dialectic as just such an approach to the unity of opposites. These are objects which intermittently fade in and out of real life, sometimes identifying with it so closely as to be indistinguishable, sometimes emerging as wholly separate and distinct spheres or practices which have nothing to do with the everyday. But such ambiguities are not to be overcome by precise definitions and conceptual delimitations, but rather constitute structural characteristics around which any thinking of them must centrally and primarily orient itself. The end of religion in secularization and modernity will therefore be no less problematic and equivocal than the end of art itself, let alone the end of history, which is a wholly different proposition from either of these. We must therefore see if there exist other such phenomena in the contemporary world to which semi-autonomy of this kind might be attributed. As for picture thinking, it is certainly noteworthy to what degree that popular German idealist or romantic concept called imagination plays so little a part in Hegel's writing or system, and one is tempted to conjecture that it is precisely the omnipresence of the role of so-called picture thinking, Vorstellung, in Hegel that leaves so little place for it. Picture thinking would seem for Hegel to have a strong kinship with Verstand, or in other words with the common sense empirical thinking of externality, formed in the experience of solid objects and obedient to the law of non-contradiction. But where reason, Vernunft, what we may often simply call the dialectic, has the task of transforming the necessary errors of Verstand into new and dialectical kinds of truths, its vocation when faced with picture thinking is somewhat different. If Verstand brings with it the errors of empiricism, picture thinking on the other hand is already an experience of truth, albeit a distorted and preconceptual one. Reason must transcend and transform the errors of Verstand, but it must hermeneutically recover the truths of Vorstellung, even though the latter have also been formed into images in accordance with the logic of the senses and of externality. For the idealist then, images are presumably already part of spirit in ways in which sense impressions are not, or at least not obviously, or to put it another way, we do not bring to the exercise of picture thinking the same kind of certainty which accompanies Verstand. The former is somehow fictional or imaginary, while the latter is legitimated by reference to external objects. We can convey the difference metaphysically, and in a perhaps less attractive idealistic way, by conceiving both these faculties as entangled in the body and therefore in the sensory. Verstand then accepts these limitations and invents its conceptuality and its language on the basis of the physical, while Vorstellung attempts to transcend the sensory by means of the sensory, designating itself as necessarily incomplete and unsatisfactory, as the determinate failure to attain the realm of the notion, or biography. To be sure, the translation of Vorstellung as picture thinking is already an interpretation in itself, and it is perhaps not the term that would seem the most appropriate one if one consults Encyclopedia Volume 3, Hegel's Anthropology, or Philosophy of Spirit, paragraph 451 and thereafter, where Wallace and Miller render the German as representation. But if one examines the discussion, in the lectures on the philosophy of religion, of what is surely the paradigmatic form of Vorstellung in Hegel's system, namely the Trinity, the pictorial dimension of such thought is inescapable, particularly insofar as so much of Hegel's early writings are concerned with this theological concept. Indeed, the formal similarities of the tripartite dialectic with the theological interpretation of the Trinity have led many interpreters either to locate the origins of the dialectic in these theological reflections or else to pronounce Hegel a Christian thinker without further ado. But such similarities, and the differences they also necessarily entail, will be very useful indeed in establishing the relationship of such picture thinking to what Hegel characterizes as the truly philosophical thinking of the Begriff notion, which mere abstraction is perhaps too poor a term to convey. It is certain that Hegel's theorization of this relationship is rather shaky. We cannot appreciate what is meant by filling, stuffy in the following passage, for example, without wondering whether it is not itself picture thinking, but as religion here is, to begin, immediate. This distinction has not yet returned into spirit. What is posited is only the notion of religion. In this the essence is self-consciousness, which is conscious of being all truth and contains all reality within that truth. This self-consciousness has, as consciousness, itself for object. Spirit which, to begin with, has an immediate knowledge of itself is thus to itself spirit in the form of immediacy, and the determinateness of the form in which it appears to itself is that of mere being. This being, it is true, is filled neither with sensation nor a manifold material, nor with any other kind of one-sided moments, purposes, and determinations. It is filled with spirit and is known by itself to be all truth and reality. Such filling is not identical with its shape. Spirit qua essence is not identical with its consciousness. Spirit is actual as absolute spirit only when it is also for itself in its truth as it is in its certainty of itself, or when the extremes into which, as consciousness, it parts itself are explicitly for each other in the shape of spirit. The shape which spirit assumes as object of its consciousness remains filled by the certainty of spirit as by its substance. Through this content, the object is saved from being degraded to pure objectivity, to the form of negativity of self-consciousness. Spirit's immediate unity with itself is the basis, or pure consciousness, within which consciousness parts asunder, into the duality of subject and object. In this way spirit, shut up within its pure self-consciousness, does not exist in religion as the creator of a nature in general. What it does create in this movement are its shapes qua spirits, which together constitute the completeness of its manifestation. And this movement itself is the genesis of its complete reality through its individual aspects, or through its incomplete shapes. 415 to 416. Wie aber die Religion erst unmittelbar ist diese Unterschied noch nicht in den Geist so gegangen. Es ist nur der Begriff der Religion gesetzt. In diesem ist das Wissen das Selbstbewusstsein, das sich Wort ist und in dieser Wirklichkeit entfällt. Dieses Selbstbewusstsein hat als Bewusstsein sich zum Gegenstand, der erst sich unmittelbar wissen, die Geist ist sich also Geist in der Form der Unmittelbarkeit und die Bestimmtheit der Gestalt, worin sich auskennt, ist die des Seins. Die Sein ist so weder MIT der Empfindung oder die mannigfaltigen Stoff noch MIT sonstigen einzigen Momenten, Zwecken und Bestimmungen voll, sondern MIT die Geist und Wort von sich als Wort und Wirklichkeit geübt. Diese Füllung ist auf diese Weise ihre Gestalt, als Wissen seinem Bewusstsein nicht fliegt. Ist erst als absolute Geist wirklich, indem wie in der Duifheit seiner selbst, sich auch in seiner Wort ist, oder die Extrem, in der sich als Bewusstsein teilt, in Geistesgestalt füreinander seint. Die Gestaltung, welche der Geist als Gegenstand seines Bewusstseins annimmt, bleibt von der Duifheit des Geistes als von der Substanz voll. Durch diesen Inhalt verschwindet dies, dafür der Gegenstand zur reinen Gegenstandlichkeit, die Form der Negativität des Selbstbewusstseins herabsank. Die unmittelbare Einheit des Geistes MIT sich selbst ist die Grundlage der reines Bewusstsein, innerhalb dessen das Bewusstsein auseinandertritt. Auf diese Weise in sein reines Selbstbewusstsein geschlossen, existiere in der Religion nicht als der Scope für eine Nature überhaupt, sondern muss in dieser Bewegung herbringen, sein Gestalten als Geister, die zusammen die Wohlständigkeit seiner Erscheinung ausmachen, und diese Bewegung selbst ist das Wurden seiner vollkommenen Wirklichkeit durch die einzelnen Sitten derselben oder seiner vollkommenen Wirklichkeiten. 501 to 2, but the drift is clear enough. Picture thinking is halfway between Verstand and Vernunft, and somehow marked as such and informed by an upward movement. When religion has been raised to the level of picture thinking, Vorstellung, it acquires a polemic cast. Its content is not grasped in sensory intuition nor immediately in picture form, but rather mediately, on the way to abstraction, and the sensory or pictorial has been lifted, oft haben, into the general, and this sublation necessarily includes a negative relationship to the pictorial. Yet this negative direction strikes not only the form, such that the difference between intuition and Vorstellung would be present in form alone, but also touches content. In intuition idea and mode of representation are so closely connected that both appear as one, and the pictorial as the meaning of an idea so essentially connected with it that it cannot be separated from it. Picture thinking, however, emerges from the conviction that the absolutely true idea cannot be grasped by way of a picture. Indeed, that pictorial representation is a limitation of its content. Picture thinking thereby sublates the unity of intuition, destroys the unity of the picture and its meaning, and lifts the latter up for itself. When die Religion in die Form der Vorstellung erhoben ist, so hat sie so etwas Polemisches in sich. Der Inhalt wird nicht im Sinn in Anschauung, nicht auf bildlich Weise unmittelbar aufgeführt, sondern mittelbar auf die Weg der Abstraction, und das Sinnlich, bildlich wird in das Allgemeine erhoben, und MIT dieser Erhebung ist dann notwendig das negative Verhalten zum bildlich in Wirklichkeit. Dies negative Richtung betrifft eben nicht nur die Form, so darf in dieser der Unterschied der Anschauung und Vorstellung lag, sondern sie basiert auch den Inhalt. Für die Anschauung hängt die Idee und die Weise der Darstellung so eng zusammen, dafür beits als eins erscheint, und das bildlich hat die Bedeutung, dafür die Idee und das selbstständig geniert und von einem nicht getrennt werden kann. Die Vorstellung hinged jet davon US, dafür die absolut wahrhaft Idee der kein Bild nicht gefit werden kann und die bildlich Weise ein Bestschranken des Inhalts sie hat daher die Einheit der Anschauung auf, verwirft die Einigkeit des Bilds und seine Bedeutung und hat dies für sich Heroes.39 it will not be necessary, particularly in an essay aiming to displace the older schema of the tripartite movement in Hegel with an account of other rhythms, to dwell laboriously on its two-fold role in the religion chapters. In the Trinity God is the universal, Christ the particular, and the Holy Spirit the individual, while in Hegel's overall developmental scheme of religious history, the premodern sublime is the universal, Greek anthropomorphism the particular, and the Christian or Trinitarian religion the individual. We are, however, here more interested in the relationship of these religious figures to Vernunft, or formerly philosophical thinking, and we must admit that, owing as much as anything else to political considerations, to prudence and self-censorship, Hegel's practical implication is ambiguous and it is not clear whether religion is meant to live on after the inauguration of speculative thought, and to coexist with it like a kind of figural accompaniment or indeed a pedagogical propedeutic, or whether, like the infamous end of art, it will at that point also have served its purpose and may be allowed to die out altogether. The question also includes the issue of esoteric versus exoteric doctrine raised in Hegel's introduction. At any rate, it would seem that the transition out of picture thinking involves the intervention of our old friend production, in a way both reminiscent of Vico, the verum factum, and anticipatory of the contemporary aesthetic, for which reification is defined as the removal of traces of production from the product. Hegel asserts in this context that what is thought of ceases to be something, merely, thought of, something alien to the self's knowledge, only when the self has produced it, and therefore beholds the determination of the object as its own. 504, 417, denn das Wortstult nur dadurch auf, Wortstult zum seinem Wissen fremd zu sein, dafür das selbst es hervorgebracht hat und also die Bestimmung des Gegenstandes als die Seinig, somit sich in einem Scout. 504. It is an idea which is not without its dangers for Christianity, even of the Lutheran or inward feeling forward/pietistic kind, but also not without its philosophical and literary critical problems as well, inasmuch as even the bracketing of the old ideas of authorial intention may not be enough to render our picture thinking fully conscious as a signifying project. But now it is time to come at all this from the vantage point of contemporary theories of allegory, which Hegel so largely anticipates in his treatment of religion here and in the lectures, as well as in the philosophy of history. These theories must be briefly summarized as generally entailing two propositions. The first is the radical difference between the structure of allegory and that of the symbol. The second is the repudiation of the old point-by-point reading of allegory, that is to say essentially, of the misconception of personification as allegory's predominant mode. Thus, the traditional paradigms of allegory such as Pilgrim's Progress would have to be reconceptualized in some new non-anthropomorphic way. As for the symbol, it has since Coleridge been valorized as the vehicle of unity in representation, and there is no reason to modify this description, provided it is understood that unity may no longer have the same aesthetic value for us today. Unity is indeed one of the features at play in Hegel's own account of picture thinking, but is even here to be sharply distinguished, as a result, from the process of unification as such. Picture thinking, or as it is translated here, representation, holds all sensible and spiritual content in the mode in which it is taken as isolated in its determinacy. In representation the distinct characteristics stand on their own account. They might either belong to a whole or be placed outside one another. 40 We need another term than the romantic keyword fragment to characterize such allegorical isolation of its items, and even the freestanding nature of characteristics belonging to a whole such as Joyce's bodily organs in Ulysses. The parts are not fragments but complete in themselves, and yet marked as parts and as conceptually dependent. Thinking on the other hand, which it is here better to call the thinking of the notion, rather than abstract or philosophical thought, emphasizes relationships. Sometimes Hegel calls it necessity in the way in which such interdependence is grasped and foreground. It therefore translates the allegorical item into a relational framework which is not at all that of the organic unity of the symbol, but which retains the relational distance of the various terms such that they may continue to be apprehended in their interaction, as in the unity of opposites, the alternation from positive to negative and back. This is then the way in which thinking in Hegel's sense does not fuse the bad isolations of the allegorical items back into the primal unity of the symbol, but rather continues to mark them as isolated from each other at the same time that it restores the web or network of their interactions. Contemporary theories of allegory thus grasp this structure as the intersection of two principles, that of the autonomy, or complete isolation and non-dependence of their items, which are in that sense not fragments, and at the same time as the marking of those items as conceptually incomplete, as relational terms in a larger signifying structure. Both of these features are then combined in the self-designation of allegory as a process rather than any achieved structure or substance. Allegory thus looks back to hallucination as a perceptual isolation of its objects, and forward to the part object as the exemplification of a larger drive that can never be fully satisfied. 41 It has been pertinently observed that Hegel's various discussions of religion must be seen as a typology rather than a teleological or developmental narrative of some kind. 42 Indeed, our rather structural reading here of the Phenomenology suggests that this approach might helpfully defamiliarize readings of Hegel's texts as a whole, recasting each moment as a determinate variation on subject/object ratios. At any rate, the typological structure is clearly visible in the picture thinking of religion, where all kinds of brilliant readings of the various religions, taken as texts, display Hegel's virtuoso permutations of such ratios. I have elsewhere proposed the example of Indian religious art as a paradigm of such reading, whose structures range from the fetish to the Trinity itself. It is an example about which one need not be defensive in the obvious sense of the limits of the cultural and historical information of Hegel's period, for he himself seems to have known just about everything there was to be known at that date, but which requires a displacement from the usual emphasis on Eurocentrism and even racism, as in the notorious evocation of Africa as a place without history, to just such a structural permutation scheme, in which the identification of this or that religion or culture is relatively indifferent, or opportunistic. Taken in this second way, the religion chapter is extraordinarily suggestive for contemporary interpretive practices and methods, and will lead us on into a final proposal for the best use of Hegel's ambiguous theory of religion as a semi-autonomous dimension of the social totality. Indeed, Hegel's notion of religion, in this final substantive chapter of the Phenomenology, may be grasped as an attempt to conceptualize, in advance and in the form of a groping historical anticipation, the problematic lineaments of what we call culture in our own period, in the broadest anthropological or cultural studies sense of what organizes daily life and interpolates and forms subjectivities. Indeed, in this sense religion today is itself, in its myriad forms, but the remnants of a cultural system which once governed all the features and contingencies of a simpler social totality, a system far more immanent to social relations and production than anything characterized as a superstructure or an ideology in the modern world. The fundamentalisms today express the nostalgia for such a seemingly more unified world than our own, yet the very possibility of the concept of religion as a distinct entity betrays the inevitable gap or internal distance within the traditional world which such a fantasy conceals or occults. Nor is the concept of culture foreshadowed by the Hegelian analysis of religion to be limited to aesthetics or so-called high culture or high art, although Hegel's theories are suggestive for a re-examination of this more specialized domain of culture within the vaster culture itself. Four of his three stages, the sublime, the classical and the romantic, the last two may be seen to project what is today the distinction between realism, an anthropomorphic or humanist representation of common-sense realities, and modernism or an often far more intricate reflexive art, in which the very categories of representation are themselves foreground and thereby undermined. As for the moment of the sublime, it manifests itself in the way in which the sheer physical presence of art and image culture absorbs the mind without a concept, whether in decoration or in a sensory fascination with the raw material of a world and image culture humanly produced. Still, in modern times, in which art has been differentiated from religion, or from what Benjamin called its cult value, it has fallen like religion itself to the level of a remnant, albeit a specialized and semi-autonomous survival which, in that also like religion, is capable of making the most overweening claims for itself and its significance. It is therefore in the wider sense of culture as the organization of daily life and of the production of subjectivities designed to function within a specific mode of production, that we must look for the most relevant parallels with Hegel's account. For with the differentiation of high and low culture, the way in which media culture has seeped into what used to be high literature, while the latter has been displaced as a cultural dominant by the sonorous and the visual if not the spatial itself, culture becomes a rather different term which embraces the totality of society as something like its omnipresent expression, or, using Hegel's word in Hegel's sense, constitutes its spirit. This is the sense in which it is sometimes said that everything is cultural, and that the economic dimension, for example, is no longer visible independently, but very much expressed through the very cultural value of its objects as images in either production, work as virtuosity, Inverno 43, or simply consumption as such. Leaving aside the theoretical problems involved in assimilating this more general concept of culture to the Marxian notion of the superstructure, we may note a series of features in Hegel's philosophy of religion which are consonant with issues necessarily addressed by modern studies of culture. First of all, there is what we may call the infrastructure specific to such superstructures, namely the existence of institutions and of intellectuals specific to them, a traditional church and priesthood which has in modern times opened up into a variety of intellectual production fields and the specialists who staff them, from the personnel of the advertising and entertainment industries and the academics and journalists concerned with cultural analysis and dissemination to the curators of museums and the government functionaries in charge of cultural budgets, not to speak of the retailers in the art market and analogous networks in the other arts. It is clear that from this perspective culture today has its performative dimension, something equivalent to Hegel's discussion of the rituals of the religious cult. It has its specific affectivities, or effects, which are probably more complex than what Hegel derived as the sheer feeling evoked by contemporary religious ideologists such as Schleiermacher. And it has, finally, its own multiple versions of attention between representationality, or realism in the high arts, and reflexivities of all kinds, something analogous to modernism, but taking any number of distinct forms from self-referential and ironic advertisements and commercials to the more literary forms of mass culture. But it is Hegel's practice of allegorical analysis, in his approach to religious forestelling or picture thinking, which is perhaps the most suggestive feature of his philosophy of religion. For here already the conceptual content of what still remains non-abstract and embodied in the various specific material languages of the arts or of narrative is acknowledged and deciphered according to a variety of hermeneutic schemes, which foreshadow ideological analysis as such. The interrelationship of culture and ideology is very much dialectical in the Hegelian sense, the sense of a kind of unity of opposites of representation and meaning, or rather, better still, of the impossibility of thinking either of these dimensions autonomously and in the absence of a dialectical definition of each by the other. It is in this way that the heterogeneity of Hegel's approaches to that he calls religion can stand as an unexpected methodological lesson for contemporary cultural studies, a proposition I will try to elaborate elsewhere.